George always arrived at the factory early. Before the sun was even up, he was already there, pushing his cleaning cart through the empty hallways. The sound of the small wheels echoed in the still dark warehouses, mixed with the smell of oil, dust, and brewed coffee coming from the employee kitchen. He wore the navy blue uniform, a bit worn at the elbows, and always the same flat-brimmed cap that read NYY, a gift from his son, Pete. George had worked there for 20 years. When he started, the factory was small. It only had about 30 employees, but over time, he watched the company grow, replace machines, open new departments. He saw people come, people go. He saw crises and he saw boom times. But he was still there, in the same job, with the same salary. What nobody realized about George was this: he wasn't just a janitor. While sweeping the corridors or wiping down the offices, George paid attention to everything. He listened to the conversations of the managers, the owners, the salespeople. He learned terms no one imagined he would know: cash flow, fixed costs, profit margin. George didn't have a college degree, but he had curiosity and drive. Sometimes he would even quietly correct someone when they said something financially foolish, but most of the time, he kept quiet, because he knew that to almost everyone there he was just the cleaning guy. At coffee break, George kept to his corner. He'd grab his plastic cup, sit in a chair in the back, and just listen. One day, he heard the manager complain, "This factory isn't going to make it. Costs have gone up too much. The boss is tired." Another day, he heard the owner say, his voice choked with emotion, "If things don't get better, I'm going to have to close down." Each of these conversations was a stab to George's heart, because for him, that factory wasn't just a job. It was his whole life. It was where he had managed to support his family, buy their little car, pay for his son's school, and he couldn't stand the idea of seeing it all end. At home, at night, George would study. He had a notebook full of notes. He drew graphs, jotted down ideas. He did the math. One day, Pete asked him, "Dad, why do you study so much when you already work all day?" And George replied, without taking his eyes off the notebook, "Because one day I'm going to need this, son." And Pete smiled, not quite understanding. He thought his dad was a little crazy, but he also felt proud. At the factory, no one suspected that this man in a blue work coat knew so much about the company's numbers. He knew the cost of production. He knew how much came in and how much went out every month. He knew the old machines used too much energy, that freight was getting expensive, that the company needed to modernize. George observed everything. While cleaning the floors, he noticed details no one else did. Machines sitting idle for too long, unmotivated employees, products gathering dust in the warehouse. One day, the factory owner, Mr. Roberts, came in early. George was cleaning the office. Mr. Roberts walked in, sighed deeply, threw his briefcase on the desk, and said, without looking at George, "I don't know what to do anymore. I think I've reached my limit." George stopped, leaned his mop in a corner, and asked carefully, "Are you thinking of closing the factory, Mr. Roberts?" Mr. Roberts looked at him, surprised. "You understand these things, George?" George just shrugged. "Understand? Well, I don't know. But I hear a lot of things around here, and I see a lot of others." Mr. Roberts let out a tired laugh. "If you have a solution, let me know, because I'm all out." George remained quiet, but at that moment something inside him shifted. That day he went home a different man, a distant look in his eyes, his head full of thoughts. He ate dinner in silence, pushing food around his plate without really eating. His wife, Sonia, asked if he was sick. He just replied, "I'm fine, Sonia. Just thinking about some things." Afterward, he locked himself in the small room out back where he kept his tools and his notebook, and he stayed there, writing until the early hours of the morning. Because on that day, George made a decision no one would ever have imagined. The next day, George woke up before his alarm went off. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, thinking about everything Mr. Roberts had said. His face was serious, as if he were carrying a new weight. Sonia woke up and asked what was wrong. George replied that everything was fine, but there was something different in his voice. He left the house, even earlier than usual, and walked slowly to the factory, feeling the cold morning wind on his face. The neighborhood was still dark, with only a few windows lit. He thought about his co-workers, about the years he had spent inside those walls, and for the first time, he thought about being the owner of that place. Arriving at the factory, he put on his uniform, grabbed his cleaning cart, and began his usual routine. Except this time, he wasn't paying attention to the dirt on the floor. His mind was far away, doing calculations, remembering everything he had heard over the years. He remembered the manager's conversations complaining about costs, the suppliers delaying deliveries, the salaries the owner could barely afford to pay. He knew every detail. He even knew how many days of cash the company had left to stay afloat. No one knew this, but George did. At coffee break, George stood in his corner, holding his plastic cup, pretending to listen to his colleagues talk about sports and soap operas. But his mind was racing. He knew he needed to find out more. He knew he couldn't just walk up to Mr. Roberts and say, "I want to buy the company," without knowing exactly what he was doing. So he decided he needed help. He couldn't do it all alone. When his shift ended, George didn't go home. He took the bus downtown and got off on a street full of commercial buildings. He went up to the third floor of an old building and knocked on the door of a small office with a sign that read, "Alden and Son Accounting." Inside, he found Mr. Alden, a bald man with thick glasses who had once helped George sort out a mess with his income taxes. George sat down in the chair across from him and began to speak, softly, almost ashamed. He explained that the factory was doing poorly, that the boss was tired, and that he, George, was thinking of making an offer to buy the place. The accountant just sat there looking at him without saying anything for a few seconds. Then he said, "George, do you have any idea how big this is? Buying a company isn't like buying a bicycle." George said he knew, but he said he couldn't just stand by and watch the place go under. Mr. Alden scratched his head, sighed, and asked how much George had saved. George told him a modest amount, the result of years of putting a little money away. The accountant did some quick math and said it wasn't nearly enough, but he said there were ways to get the rest. He would need partners, or maybe a loan, and above all, he would need to prove that the company could be profitable. George sat quietly, just nodding his head. Mr. Alden, though he thought it was crazy, saw that the look in George's eyes was serious, and he said, "All right, let's do this. Bring me the factory's numbers, everything you know. Costs, sales, debts, whatever. Then I'll see if it's possible." On the way home, George was different. The bus rattled over the potholed streets, but he didn't even notice. He just stared out the window, thinking about what he had to do. He knew it would be difficult. He knew he could lose everything. But he also knew that if he didn't try, he would regret it for the rest of his life. When he got home, Sonia was worried. She asked where he had been. He simply replied, "I'm trying to save the factory." She thought he was joking, but George was serious. And he said, "Sonia, do you trust me?" She said yes, but that she was scared. George held her hand tightly and said, "Then believe in me. I know what I'm doing." That night, George took out his old notebook, the one full of notes, and started to write. He wrote down everything he knew about the factory. How many employees, how much energy was used per month, which machines were always breaking down, which department sold the most, which product was sitting in stock. He stayed up almost until dawn writing, because on that day, George had decided he was going to do something no one ever imagined he was capable of. The next day, George arrived at the factory with a tired face but a determined gaze. He walked through the gate, greeted the security guard with a nod, and went straight to the locker room to put on his uniform. As he changed, he thought about everything he had written in his notebook the night before. Every number, every detail about the factory was there. He knew he needed that material to convince Mr. Roberts and any investor that the business could still succeed. As he swept the main corridor, George kept glancing at the clock, counting the minutes until the coffee break, because that was when the managers would meet in the glass-walled room where they always talked about the company's finances. George didn't want to miss a word. When the clock struck 9:30, he left his cleaning cart in a corner, grabbed his cloth, and entered the glass room, pretending he was going to clean the table. The managers paid him no mind. They were busy discussing numbers. The finance manager was speaking loudly about how the company was behind on payments to suppliers, that there was no money to buy raw materials, and that the banks no longer wanted to renew their lines of credit. Another manager said maybe it was better to reduce the number of employees. George felt a tightness in his chest. He knew how important those jobs were to a lot of people, including himself. The finance manager commented that Mr. Roberts seemed to have already thrown in the towel. He said the boss was tired, in poor health, and had no more energy to continue. George left there with his mind racing. At lunchtime, he ate quickly, barely tasting his food, and went straight to Mr. Roberts. He found his boss sitting in his office, looking out the window, with a look on his face like he was 1,000 miles away. George entered slowly and asked if he could talk. Mr. Roberts said yes, but he hardly seemed to be paying attention. George took a deep breath and began, "Mr. Roberts, I know you're tired. I know the factory's on its last legs, but I think this company can still succeed." Mr. Roberts looked up, surprised. He asked if George knew the size of the hole the company was in. George said he did. He said he wasn't just the cleaning guy, that he heard everything, saw everything, and that he had written down numbers, details, costs, losses, everything. Mr. Roberts' eyes widened. He asked if George was saying he wanted to help. George then dropped it. "I'm thinking of buying the factory." The boss let out a tired laugh, shook his head, and said it was madness. But George insisted. He said he wasn't joking, that he had money saved, that he was already talking to an accountant, and that he thought that, with the right changes, the company could become profitable again. Mr. Roberts rubbed his forehead, was silent for a while, then said he needed to think, and he told George not to mention anything to anyone. George promised he would keep quiet. He left there trembling, but feeling his heart beat stronger than ever. When he went back to work, the factory looked different to his eyes. Every machine made noises he hadn't noticed before. Every employee who walked by, he saw as someone he wanted to protect. He knew if he failed, he could lose everything. But at that moment, George felt more alive than ever. On his way out, he went to Mr. Alden's office again. He sat in the chair and told him he had spoken with his boss. The accountant got serious. He said that if Mr. Roberts was really willing to sell, George needed to be prepared to find hidden debts. He also said that money alone wasn't enough, that George would need to convince the banks, the suppliers, and above all, the employees themselves, that he was capable of running the business. George listened to everything, nodding. He said he wouldn't give up. He said that factory was everything to him, that he was willing to put his whole life on the line. The accountant sighed and said he would help in any way he could, but he warned that it would be hard, very hard. On the way home, George sat on the bus, leaning against the window, watching the city lights. He thought about Sonia, about Pete, about his friends at the factory, and he felt a lump in his chest. He knew that if he was going to go forward, he would have to tell his family, but he also knew that if he didn't try, he would never forgive himself. That night, George came home determined. He knew he still had a long way to go. But for the first time, he began to believe that the cleaning guy could become the boss. That night, George arrived home with a serious look on his face. Sonia noticed right away that something was wrong. She asked if he was sick or if there had been a problem at the factory. George shook his head, pulled out a chair, and told Pete to sit down too. He said he needed to have a serious talk with the family. Pete, at 12 years old, looked on curiously, holding his school notebook in his lap. Sonia sat down slowly, her hand clutching her apron, as she always did when she was nervous. George took a deep breath and said he had decided to try to buy the factory. Sonia's eyes widened. She asked if he had gone crazy. She said that wasn't something for a janitor, that it was a rich people's affair. George explained everything calmly. He told her how for years he had been listening to the boss's conversations, that he knew everything about the factory, that he had written down numbers, that he had even spoken to the accountant. Sonia started to cry, saying it would be the end of their family, that they would lose even their house. But George took her hand and said softly, "Sonia, I know it's risky, but if I don't try, the factory will close. And then not just me, but all my friends there will lose their jobs." Pete looked at his father with shining eyes. He asked, "Dad, does that mean you could be the owner of the factory?" George smiled faintly and said he could if everything went well. Sonia wiped her tears and said she didn't understand any of it, but that she trusted him. And she asked for just one thing, that he not hide anything from her anymore. George promised he wouldn't. That night was the first time the whole family went to sleep, thinking their lives could change completely. The next day, George woke up before the sun, as always. He took the bus to the factory, but his heart felt like it was beating faster than ever. When he walked through the gates, everything seemed different. The smell of oil, the noise of the machines, the sound of the employees talking. It was as if he was seeing the place for the first time. He thought, one day, this could be mine. As he pushed his cleaning cart through the hallways, George observed every corner. He saw idle machines, accumulated pallets, poorly organized boxes. He made a mental note of it all. He knew that every detail could make a difference if he were the boss. He passed by the painting department and saw the supervisor complaining to two employees. He was saying that the paint supplier was late and that production would have to stop if they didn't solve it soon. George stopped a little further away, pretending to be cleaning but listening to every word. Another piece of the puzzle was falling into place in his head. At lunchtime, George called Caesar, a colleague from the cleaning crew, over for a talk. Cesar had been working there for 15 years and was one of his few close friends. They sat in a corner, away from the others, eating from their lunch pails. George said, a little embarrassed, "Cesar, I'm thinking of buying this factory." Cesar almost choked on his rice. He asked if George had hit his head, but George explained everything, said he was already talking to the accountant, that he knew he didn't have the money alone, but that he was going to try to find investors. Cesar was quiet, looking at his friend with respect. He said, "If anyone here can do it, it's you, George. You know this factory better than any boss." That gave George strength. Knowing he wasn't alone made all the difference. That same day, after his shift, George decided to speak with Mr. Roberts again. He knocked on the office door and entered slowly. Mr. Roberts was sitting, shuffling papers, looking even more tired than the day before. George said, "Mr. Roberts, I'm serious about buying the factory." The boss took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and said he didn't even know where to begin. He said the factory owed money to the bank, had debts with suppliers, had labor lawsuits. He said the situation was worse than it seemed, but George was not deterred. He said he wanted to see the numbers, that he needed to understand everything, every debt, every detail. Mr. Roberts was impressed. He said he never thought he'd be having this conversation with the janitor, but after a moment of silence, he said, "All right, George, tomorrow I'll show you the books. But don't get your hopes up, son. The hole is deep." George left there with his heart racing. He was scared, of course, but at the same time, he had never felt so much courage in his life. The next day, George could barely drink his coffee. He was so nervous. Sonia kept asking if he was sure about what he was doing. He said he was, but you could see in his eyes that he was afraid. Even so, he put on Pete's cap, grabbed his lunch pail, and went to the factory. When he got there, he tried to work normally, but his mind was a million miles away. When 9 o'clock struck, he went to Mr. Roberts's office, knocked on the door, and went in. The boss was there, with a pile of spreadsheets scattered across his desk, looking exhausted. Mr. Roberts asked George to sit. They were silent for a few seconds until the factory owner began to explain. He showed papers, reports, bank statements. He said the company owed a lot of money to the bank and that suppliers had been demanding payment for months. He said that if it weren't for some big sales in the past, they would have already closed their doors. George listened in silence, nodding his head. Every now and then he would ask questions, surprising Mr. Roberts. He asked about fixed costs, about the payroll, about the machines that were always breaking down. The boss would look at him, half in disbelief that the janitor knew so much. When they finished, Mr. Roberts sighed deeply and said, "George, I don't know how you're going to do this, but if anyone here knows this factory, it's you." George thanked him, shook his boss's hand, and left the office carrying a stack of papers. He put everything in an old backpack he used for his lunch, and he went to work as if nothing had happened. He spent the whole day cleaning the floor, but his mind was far away, reviewing numbers, thinking of solutions. When it was time to go home, he took the bus downtown and went straight to Mr. Alden's office. The accountant opened the door and was startled to see George loaded down with paperwork. He said he looked like an executive. George laughed and put everything on the table. Mr. Alden began to look through the spreadsheets one by one, jotting things down in a notepad. After almost 2 hours, he said seriously, "George, the situation isn't impossible. It's difficult, but it's not impossible." George's eyes widened with hope. Mr. Alden explained that the company had high debt, but it still had loyal customers, a good reputation in the market, and machinery that, if modernized, could double production. He also said that the market was starting to pick up again. The accountant explained that George would need partners or an investor who believed in the plan. He said they needed to put together a solid project to present to the bank. George took notes, paying attention to every word. He looked like a student in school, absorbing every detail. Mr. Alden also said that George needed to think not only about the purchase, but also about the costs that would come after, like salaries, energy, taxes. George nodded his head, firm, without fear. When he left the office, it was already night. The streets were lit by the lampposts and the wind was cold. George walked slowly, thinking about everything. He knew he had a huge road ahead of him, but he also felt that he was closer than ever. When he got home, Sonia was sitting at the table, worried. She asked where he had been. George told her everything. He said it wasn't just a dream anymore. It was possible, but it would require courage and help. Sonia listened quietly. In the end, she took his hand and said, "If you believe, I believe too." George felt like crying, but he held it in. He looked at her and said, "I'm going to save this factory, Sonia, and I'm going to make Pete proud." That night, George stayed up late looking at his notes. He knew the next step would be to talk to the big players, people with money who could get in on the deal. And deep down, he was terrified, but he was also determined. He knew his whole life was on the line. And for the first time, he didn't feel like just a janitor. He felt like a man capable of changing everything. The next day, George woke up in the dark. He could barely eat any breakfast. It felt like there was a knot in his stomach. Sonia looked at him and said she was worried, but George tried to smile and said everything was fine. But inside, he felt the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. When he got to the factory, he put on his uniform, grabbed his cleaning cart and started his shift, but his head was somewhere else. Every employee who passed him, George thought about how that person had a family, children, bills to pay. He thought that if the factory closed, it wouldn't just be him losing everything, but hundreds of people. While sweeping near the maintenance department, the area supervisor stopped to talk. He said the old machines were constantly breaking down and that the repairs alone were eating up half the company's money. George listened to every word, committing it all to memory. He knew this would be crucial to convince any investor that he needed to modernize the industrial park. Later, he went to the stockroom. He noticed there was a lot of unsold inventory, products that no one was managing to sell. He thought to himself that this was money just sitting there, and that he needed to find a way to move that stock to generate cash quickly. At lunchtime, George called Caesar over again. They went to eat in a corner, away from the others. George told him all about the meeting with Mr. Roberts and about the accountant saying it was possible to save the factory. Caesar looked at him seriously and said, "George, you're going to need courage. Because when things start to get serious, a lot of people show up wanting to take down the guy who's trying to rise." George agreed. He said he was already prepared to face that, but deep down he was afraid. Not just afraid of losing money, but afraid of failing, of becoming a laughingstock, of disappointing his family. After his shift, George went straight to Mr. Alden's office again. The accountant was waiting with a folder full of documents. He said he had already put together a draft of a business plan. He explained that the company still had market value, but that to buy it, George would need to raise at least $1.5 million just to settle debts and get the house in order. George almost fell out of his chair. $1.5 million sounded like money from another planet to him. But the accountant said that if George could find partners or investors, he could remain the majority partner, even if he came in with less money, as long as he could prove he had the ability to make the factory profitable again. George asked who these people who might invest could be. Mr. Alden explained it could be a group of angel investors, banks, or even former clients of the factory who didn't want to see the company close. George thought about it. He remembered several clients he had seen coming into the company for years. He remembered one in particular, a Mr. Arnold, the owner of a chain of stores who always praised the quality of the factory's products. He thought he could try talking to him. Even though he was scared, he decided to try. The next day, George worked up the courage and called Mr. Arnold's office. He spoke to the secretary, who almost didn't want to put the call through, but George insisted. He said it was a serious matter about the factory. Mr. Arnold answered, a bit impatient, asking who he was. George said, "My name is George. I've been working in the cleaning crew at the factory for 20 years, but I know everything that goes on in there, and I'm trying to save the place." On the other end of the line, there was silence for a few seconds. Then Mr. Arnold said, "All right, George, come by my office tomorrow at 10. I want to hear what you have to say." George hung up the phone with a shaking hand. He stood there staring at the receiver, trying to process the size of the step he had just taken. He knew that if it went wrong, it could be humiliating, but he also knew he had to try. When he got home, he told Sonia. She was scared, but she said, "George, you've always been a hard worker. If anyone deserves a chance, it's you." That night, George barely slept. He rehearsed what he was going to say to Mr. Arnold. He thought about every word, every number, because he knew that the next day he could be taking the first step to becoming the owner of the factory where he had spent his entire life pushing a mop. The next day, George woke up while it was still dark. The clock read 5:30 in the morning. He sat on the edge of the bed, running his hands over his face, feeling his heart beat so hard it felt like it would jump out of his chest. Sonia woke up too and asked if he was okay. George just said that he had to be. He put on the newest shirt he had, ironed pants, and went to the mirror. He looked at his own reflection as if trying to convince himself he was capable. He took the bus downtown. The journey seemed much longer than usual. The bus swayed, passed through narrow streets, and George looked at the people around him, each lost in their own thoughts. He kept repeating in his head everything he was going to say to Mr. Arnold. He tried to remember the numbers Mr. Alden had given him, the cash flow, the number of employees, the value of the debts, and most of all, he tried to remember to tell Mr. Arnold that the factory could be successful again, that it wasn't just dust and broken machines, it had a future, if someone believed in it. When he arrived in front of Mr. Arnold's building, George stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, taking deep breaths. It was a beautiful building, glass facade, a large sign with the name of the store chain. Well-dressed people came and went with briefcases, cell phones, quick conversations. George felt small there, but he took a deep breath and went inside. The receptionist looked at him suspiciously, maybe because of his simple uniform, even though it was clean and well-pressed. She asked if he had an appointment. George replied, "I do at 10, with Mr. Arnold." The young woman called her boss's office, then told him to sit and wait. George sat there on a leather sofa, staring at the floor, bouncing his legs nervously. He could feel the sweat running down his back, even with the cold air conditioning. After almost half an hour, the receptionist said he could go up. George rode a mirrored elevator up, alone, and every floor that passed seemed like another step up the ladder of fear. When the doors opened, there was Mr. Arnold's office, large, with a view of the whole city. The businessman was sitting behind a huge desk, tapping on a tablet. Mr. Arnold looked up and said, "So you're George, the cleaning guy from the factory?" George replied firmly, "That's me, Mr. Arnold, but I'm also someone who knows every corner of that factory." The businessman raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He told George to sit. He asked why a janitor wanted to talk about business. George started to tell him everything. He spoke of the broken machines, the idle stock, the loyal customers, the debts, but also the solutions. He said the factory could be saved, that it didn't have to close. He said he was trying to buy the company and that he needed partners or investors. Mr. Arnold was silent for a while, just listening. Then he said, "George, do you have any idea the risk of all this? You have a family, a house to support." George said he knew, but that he couldn't stand by and watch the place he had worked his whole life die. He said he didn't want to see hundreds of families in need, that he wanted to save the company, but also make it grow again, and that he was willing to work harder than ever. Mr. Arnold crossed his arms, looking at George as if he were sizing up a piece of merchandise. Then he spoke slowly. "You know what impresses me about you. You talk about this company as if it's yours, even as a janitor. That's rare, very rare." George looked down, feeling a wave of emotion rise in his chest, but he remained firm. He said he needed someone who believed in him, someone who would help raise the money to save the factory, and he promised he wouldn't let anyone down. The businessman was silent for a few more minutes. Then he said, "George, I'll think about it. Send me all those numbers you mentioned. I want to have my accountants look at them, and then we'll talk again." George thanked him, stood up, and shook Mr. Arnold's hand firmly. He left the office with his legs feeling like jelly, but with a flame lit inside him. He felt that, for the first time, someone important was taking him seriously. On the street, George stood and watched the cars go by. The noise of the city seemed distant. He thought of Sonia, of Pete, of his friends at the factory, and he felt that he was closer than ever to achieving something no one ever imagined was possible. George went home that day with his chest puffed out. He felt like he had grown a few inches. Sonia was in the living room sewing and dropped everything when she saw her husband walk in. She asked, almost breathless, "So, what happened?" George sat next to her, took her hands, and told her everything. He said Mr. Arnold had agreed to come in as an investor, that it wouldn't be easy, but that now he had someone big on his side. Sonia cried, and this time it wasn't from fear, it was from pride. She hugged George so tightly he could barely speak. Pete came into the room and asked if his dad was really going to be the owner of the factory. George smiled and said, "I think so, son. I think it's going to happen now." The next day, George went to the factory early. He called Mr. Roberts for a conversation. The two sat in a small room with a simple table, a room George had always dusted. This time, it was different. Mr. Roberts looked at George with respect. He asked if he was sure about what he was doing. George replied that he had never been more sure of anything in his life. He said he had an investor willing to help, that he had a plan to save the factory, and he wanted to know how much the boss was asking for the business. Mr. Roberts looked at George, took a deep breath and said, "George, if it were anyone else, I wouldn't sell. But I know you love this factory. I've seen it for 20 years. So let's find a fair price." They spent hours talking, looking at the books, adding up debts, discussing contracts. George felt tired, but also more alive than ever. For the first time, he was sitting on the other side of the table. He was the one deciding the company's future. At the end of the day, they closed a deal. It wasn't cheap, but it also wasn't impossible. Mr. Roberts shook George's hand, looked him in the eye, and said, "I'm handing you the key to my dream. Take good care of it." George replied, "You can count on it, Mr. Roberts. I will." In the days that followed, George ran from one place to another. He went to the bank, signed papers, went back to Mr. Alden's office 1,000 times, made calls, explained the plan to suppliers. A lot of people were surprised. Some laughed, others said he was crazy. But George didn't stop. Every time someone doubted him, he became more determined. Because he knew he wasn't doing it just for himself. He was doing it for his friends at the factory, for the fathers of families who needed that job, and for the dignity he had always carried in his heart. When the day of the final signing came, George woke up early, put on the best shirt he had, and went to the lawyer's office. Mr. Roberts was there, serious but with a sad smile. Mr. Arnold also showed up, firm, checking every clause of the contract. The notary read everything slowly. George signed, trembling, his hands sweating. When he looked up, it was officially done. The janitor had just become the owner of the factory where he had worked his whole life. He left the office in a bit of a daze. Mr. Roberts clapped him on the back and said, "It's all on you now, my boy." Mr. Arnold shook his hand and said, "Let's make this company grow, George." George could only smile, even with his eyes full of tears. It felt like everything around him was in slow motion. The next day, George arrived at the factory early, as always. But this time he didn't put on the blue uniform. He came in a light-colored dress shirt and black pants. The employees stared, not understanding. George gathered everyone in the yard. He said, "I am the new owner here, but I will never stop being George. I know you must be scared, but I promise that no one will lose their job. We are going to save this factory together." There was a huge silence, until Caesar started to clap. Soon everyone was clapping too. Some were crying, others were smiling. George stood there, watching it all, feeling like his life had been completely turned upside down. He was no longer the cleaning guy who went unnoticed. He was the man who now held the keys to the place. In the following months, George began to put his plan into action. He replaced old machines, renegotiated debts, called old clients to come back. Mr. Arnold stood by his side through it all, and, little by little, the factory started to get out of the red. People began to look at George with respect, not just as a boss, but as someone who had the courage to fight when no one else believed. Today, George enters the factory and greets every employee by name. He still sweeps the floor from time to time just to remember where he came from. And he always says, never forget that anything is possible, even for the janitor to become the owner. All right, it's that time. If this story has you hooked, let's do the full ritual. Hit the like button to support the channel, subscribe so you don't miss a beat, and ring that bell to be the first to know what's coming. Your opinion is golden, so drop it in the comments below.